Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. So in this video we'll be talking about the second part of this knight d7 Moscow Sicilian, which again is, in my opinion, the most fighting variation of the three options on the third move. So after e4, c5, knight f3, d6, bishop b5 check, knight d7, we're going to be talking about the move d4. We've talked about castles, other moves like c4, a4, things like that in the previous video. But here we'll talk about d4 because this leads to completely different types of play, and I think black does need to be careful, but as long as they know some general ideas and also some concrete theory in the critical lines, which is not too much, but it does need to be, it is very important to remember, they should be doing fine. First off, let's look at the other options here. Knight f6 has been played in the past, and apparently black has a good score in these kind of positions, but it's not really good because I think allowing this pin on the knight is really annoying. So for example, after knight c3 and taking on d4, queen takes d4. So this is the first point where we see the idea behind playing bishop b5 and d4 so early, is to take back with the queen and see that I have potential threats of e5 maybe. I maybe want to imply pressure with bishop g5 and just make sure that this pin is annoying on the knight. And the thing is that if you ever play a6, like at this point, let's say bishop takes d7, if we take back with the bishop, and after bishop g5, this is very annoying because typically we don't want to allow the bishop to come to g5 here because it can potentially double the pawns. And if we play a move like e5 here, after a move like queen d3, black has a bad version of like this Sveshnikov Sicilian, basically, because this knight is being pinned, and typically this not... this undermines the control over black's control over the d5 square, and so this is not what black wants. This pin is quite annoying. Even if we take with the knight here, after castles and queen b6, this has been played in the past, but not really good after queen d3, and we need to prevent knight d5 somehow, so e6. But again, this weakens the d6 pawn, and white can just continue to play positionally. One line I looked at is after a4, queen c7, let's say, rook d1, bishop e7, and a5. White just has a very nice and solid advantage with potentially making use of the weak b6 square, or coming in with bishop f4 and putting pressure on g6. So I think just white has a nice and stable edge there. And instead, if we play this position e5, that white still has a stable edge because of this annoying pressure that we did not manage to relieve so early on. So after like queen d3, let's say black plays h6, which is the main move, to prevent bishop g5. After bishop e3, bishop e7, bishop c4, this is the main move. So it prophylactically steps out of a6 b5 with tempo. And so black normally plays a6 here, but now white is just in time to play a4. And after, just to prevent b5, and we play queen c7, castles, knight c5, this is the main line. After bishop takes c5, queen takes c5, and knight d5, white just dominates the d5 square. And let's say after we do this kind of exchange, and we castle, white just has a very dominating position with this bishop on d5. And let's say after rook fb1, white simply prepares b4 to gain space on the queen side, and just has a nice and stable advantage. So I don't really like this kind of position for black, which is why I think that it's very important in this line after d4 to take on d4, and after queen takes d4 is to play a6 and immediately break the pin. Additionally, we can also look at knight takes d4, which is not very serious. It just looks like a very normal open Sicilian position, but with the bishop on b5, which isn't really contributing that much. Let's say after knight f6, castles, and e5, knight f5, we can even play a6 here. And let's say after bishop d7, we can play queen d7. And objectively, this should be fine because black is going to break through with d5 next. And even a bishop d3, knight c5 seems to be the main move. And we have potentially threats of taking on f5 and playing, bishop e7 and castles with a very good position. So instead of that, queen takes d4 is the move that has been tried to pose some problems. And again, it's here that it's important to break the pin with a6. And trying to keep the pin with bishop a4 is not really good because black can play natural moves and just claim an edge because the bishop is kicked back, and once we play a move like b5, the bishop will just be not that great on b3 after we play the move e6. Let's say b5, bishop b3, we can even play knight gf6 first, and white typically can play this move bishop g5 to try to pose some problems, but here simply we can play bishop b7. Here again, it's important not to play e5 maybe it's possible, but here, in general, like with the bishop on g5, like putting pressure on with this pin, it's like not really what we want. So bishop e7, attacking e4, knight b2, e6. Now, also another reason that we wouldn't want to play e5 is that this bishop on this diagonal is now blunted with the move e6. After castles, bishop e7, a4, and castles, black just has a good game with moves like queen c7 and rook fb8 next to put pressure on the queen side. And it's just an equal game. It's not, worse or anything, but white does not have an advantage. Instead, if they play knight c3, we can play again bishop b7, castles, and e6, just playing against this bishop. And after a4, now we can even use some concrete stuff to equalize here after queen a5, pinning the a pawn. After bishop d2, we can close down the queen side with b4. After knight e2, it looks like b4 is won next, but it's a very typical idea that once the knight on c3 is kicked away, the e4 pawn becomes under pressure. So right now we can take, or we can play queen c7 first, and after bishop takes b4, now we can take on e4. And after, let's say, rook fd1, after rook c8, black just has a very active game because even though they can't castle because the bishop on f8 defends the g7 pawn, the king will actually just stay in the center. And with moves like knight e to c5 and also knight d to e5, this is quite promising for black. There's no way to get at the black king essentially, and this is quite a comfortable position. So yeah, black's already actually slightly better according to the computer there. But another line is like bishop d3 hasn't been played, but this alleviates the pressure with the pin, and it's not challenging at all. For example, I think a better move if they want to retreat the bishop is to retreat to e2. The idea is that they're keeping the d file open so that after white castles, they can play rook d1 and put pressure on the d file, potentially threatening any e5 advances. Typically with the knight on f6, e5 can be a possible threat. And so bishop e2 is stronger, but we can look at bishop d3 first. So after knight gf6, knight c3, and here, it's a typical decision where we have to, we look at the position, we need to decide, do I want to opt for an e6 setup with e6 and bishop e7, or a g6 and bishop g7 setup? And typically, if there's nothing wrong with choosing a dragon setup, that is most often the correct choice. And so here g6 followed by bishop g7 to target the queen on the potentially vulnerable d4 square is a good option. And after this position, there's like nothing wrong after bishop g7. And we can see that typical white is actually setting up for short castling. And in typical dragon positions, we know that if white ever castles short, it's not really a challenging question to be that's being asked. So black has no problems in such positions. Instead, if they play bishop e2, which has been played by Carlsen and other top players a few times, just I'm guessing it's just to like get them out of theory. And white just maintains the the queen on d4, and just saying that the b8 knight has actually just went to d7, where it would actually prefer to be on c6. So white is basically claiming that this knight on d7 is just misplaced. But white can also prepare a Marxi bind with c4. But here we just continue with knight gf6, and after c4, trying to set up a Marxi bind. It's typical that we know that against the Marxi bind, the bishop on the long diagonal is the best way to combat it. So g6 is the main move. e5 is possible, and is also a good move, where white only has one good move to defend the e4 pawn, which is queen e3, since queen d3 loses to knight c5 with a fork on the pawn and the queen. So after queen e3, d5. And now this is actually the line that was recommended by Anish Giri in his Sicilian Knight, of course. And the idea is just to sacrifice a pawn, but to open up lines for black's pieces, and they actually get very comfortable in dynamic equality here. So that's a possible line that you could look at, but I want to look at the g6 setup because this is, I think, more common. And here, after, let's say, knight c3, bishop g7, castles, we can just look at some possible continuations to get a feel of the position. After queen e3, stepping out of the long diagonal, b6, just preparing bishop b7, and black will just have like two nice bishops on the long diagonals. So after rook d1, bishop b7, what has been chosen here in the past by Nakamura is knight g5 against MVL in 2018. The idea is to free up the f3 square so that the pawn can go to f3 and set up this typical Marxi bind position because typically the pawn is on f3, the pawn is on b3 for white, and so this move just prepares f3. And here we can actually play queen c7, which not only steps steps to the c file to escape the rook putting pressure on the d file, but it also prepares potentially like queen c5 to trade the queens, because in a position where we're cramped for space, it's normally good to try to exchange pieces. So after f3, which has been played both times by Nakamura, rook a8 was chosen in the past, but I like the move queen c5. And black should be fine here theoretically, because there are ideas of rook f8 to put pressure on the c file, knight e8 to open up the bishop's diagonal, also knight e5 to put pressure on c4 if needed. In the two games, like rook a8 was played, and after bishop d2, e6, black eventually tries to play for b5, d5 here, but it's objectively not the best. So instead of knight g5, h3 is also possible. And this has been played in the past, but we just play our normal stuff. Queen c7, rook b1, rook fc8. The rooks actually belong here because the rook on the a file can be quite useful if the a file opens up. After bishop d2, again queen c5, typical idea. And after, let's say, queen d3, avoiding the queen exchange, which would make black's task easier. Queen c7, preparing knight c5 now to attack e4. b4, trying to prevent knight c5, but now we play a5. And here, if b5 is played, then the c5 square is a clear outpost. So white should probably play a3, but now we play bishop a6, targeting c4, forcing the pawn to b5, and then now we get the c5 square for the knight with just a very nice position here after knight d5. It's typical that we know that we shouldn't take on d5 anyway, because after e takes d5, the pawn on e7 becomes a backward pawn. So here we simply retreat with queen d8, and we have ideas of playing e6, or even knight d7 first, followed by e6 to kick away the knight on d5. And black is already slightly better in this kind of position. So instead of that, instead of this bishop e2 move, bishop takes d7 is the main move. And the idea is that white gives away the bishop pair, but gets, they have a big lead in development, they gain time and can use this to try to create some pressure. And in this position, there are 4 moves. Moves like castles and knight c3 can most likely transpose, but there are alternative options of like white playing c4 to establish Mark's spine, or this interesting move bishop g5, which is a risky sideline. But the idea is that it makes it a bit difficult for black to play e5 because the queen on d8 is hanging. And also it makes it difficult to play knight f6 because bishop takes f6 is a positional threat. So here it's important to play h6 to kick away the bishop from its original diagonal. So we want to kick it away from this diagonal. And so if they simply retreat with bishop e3, then after e5, we just get a free tempo, basically. A free h6 move, while white has moved the bishop twice. So bishop h4 is the only move. And now rook c8. So I like this move because it puts pressure on the c-pawn. And so now white can castle here. And just potentially gambit the c2 pawn just to gain space, or against time, sorry. But here, we can just play queen c7 and put pressure on the c file, preparing e5 next. And after this, let's say e5, this is the only way to deviate from the main position. For example, if knight c3 happens, then I think playing a move like e5, queen d3, and then even g5 here. This is a very typical idea we will see in this variation with the early bishop g5, where the bishop on g3 actually is very, very vulnerable, or it's just not even vulnerable, but even it's just a bad piece long term, because the bishop has no future on this diagonal. And even though we weaken the king side and also the d5 square, we're simply just not going to castle on the king side. We're just going to leave our king in the center, play bishop first I'll play knight f6, play bishop e6, and bishop e7, and even it's possible to continue with the king side attack with like, rook g8, h5, things like that. So this is quite a nice position for black. And instead, if they play e5, which is the only way to deviate, black can actually play the move d5. Very nice pawn sacrifice. It's actually necessary to get this move, because after queen takes e5, we're going to play e6 with tempo to open up our pieces. Let's say if we play a move like e6, then after knight bd2 and we play d5, white is just in time to play c4 and open up the position with a lot of initiative. So instead, if we play d5, let's say if they ignore our d-pawn, we can simply play queen c5 with a comfortable game, trying to trade the queens, and we have good pressure on the c-file and the two bishops, obviously. So instead, if they take on d5, we play e6 with tempo, queen d4, and now g5. Again, the typical idea of making just this bishop bad. And for bishop g3 and knight e7, the knight is coming to f5, and black finishes development where we're only down one pawn, but we're gonna have two active bishops on c6 and c5 next. So this is just a very nice position for black. So instead of that, I think, yeah, after if they castle, that's what's gonna happen. But the main move knight c3. But here we can actually play the move e5, and this is an important tactical idea because a bishop takes d8 can be met with e takes d4, where both the knight on c3 and the bishop on d8 hangs. So black is going to win a piece. So instead, if they play queen d3, which is the main move, we go for the typical idea of playing g5, shutting the bishop out to g3, and now again we have the weak d5 square and weak king side, but as long as we control the d5 square with moves like bishop e6 and knight f6 and play bishop e7 to maintain control or to defend the d6 pawn, black should be doing very well here, as long as they don't castle short. Let's say knight f6 and castle long is possible. This was played actually by in a tournament that I played in an open tournament by the Australian junior Lucas Nee, who's very young but very talented. He played this, and I just continued with bishop I did not continue with this move, but actually this would have been best. So I think in the game, and it would be most natural here to play queen c7. But it's actually better to play bishop e7 so that you keep options of both queen c7 and queen a5 alive. So you have ideas of like b5, b4 followed up with that. And yeah, there is actually no need in this kind of position to castle kingside because the king is perfectly safe on e8. There's no ways to like, any pawn breaks to open up the position. So yeah, essentially that's what could happen if they castle long. But if they play h4, trying to undermine the king side, here we can play g4, closing this king side, and after knight d2, the idea here with knight d2, again, is a typical idea to bring the knight to e3 via c4 and to control the d5 square. So it's important not to allow that. So here the main move has been b5, but it does get hit with a4. So I do like the move bishop e6. The bishop just belongs here, and it covers the c4 square. After like a move like h5, trying to prepare bishop h4, we can play queen a5, and we have just very nice counterplay on the queen side. After, let's say, bishop h4, we can just simply take the pawn. Let's say g3. We can play queen b6 back, attacking b2, knight b3, rook g8, castles. And now a safe move here would be just rook g6. I like this move. Played by, played in the 2004 game. Queen takes f2 has been played, is objectively best, but yeah, black does need to be careful with the f-file opening up. So I do like rook g6. And yeah, just defending against the 6th rank, and it's not very, it's not a greedy move. After knight d5, let's say, bishop d5 is an improvement, and if queen d5, we can play queen c6. We want to trade the queens off since we're up a pawn, and with knight f6 next, black just has a nice position. Instead, if they play e takes d5, now we can play knight g7, preparing f5 next. And surprisingly, f5 does not weaken the king side that much, because our king is perfectly fine. In the center there. The only break that I can see is either go for f3 or go for c4, c5, which is not happening anytime soon. So black gets a very fine game here. And the bishop on h4 is not amazing. So instead, after queen a5, a3 is possible, which was played by Zarnicki against Matlakov in 2019 World Rapid Championships. And improving on the game here, instead of rook g8, bishop e7 is just a nice move because it's completely unnecessary to play rook g8 after castles. And it's rare here that we do castle short, but in this position it's possible because black is actually faster with the counterplay, with moves like doubling on the c-file, following rook c6, rook fc8, or b5, b4, just to open up the white king. The castling queenside plan is like very risky for white even. So yeah, black just gets the other rook into the game with a good position. So this is the line with bishop g5. Just note some of the critical ideas of playing h6 followed by g5 at some point, Normally we play e5 first, followed by g5, and it's typical that the rook belongs on c8 in this kind of variation, so it can also be a useful waiting move when you're unsure of like what's the what's the best move in this specific position. So instead of bishop g5, c4 is possible, going for a Moroxy bind, but here it's not too dangerous. Here we just continue with knight f6, and if knight c3, we just play g6, play bishop g7 with which transposes to the 7th move's castles instead of c4. Instead of bishop g5, then here we can play knight e6, going for a simple setup. We do weaken the d6 pawn, but after bishop e7, rook c8, bishop c6, we have a lot of counterplay against the e4 pawn in the center. Let's say knight c3, bishop e6, completing development, castles. White has a lot of moves here, and we can look at just a few of them. Rook fe1 is possible, but here we play bishop c6, improving the bishop, rook ad1, and now h6. So now the bishop is either kicked away, and after that we can continue with like rook c8, queen c7, or queen a5 even. I like queen a5 and the rook, bringing the rook to d8 quite nicely. This looks quite good for black, but I could be wrong. Instead of bishop to f6 is possible, and they will win a pawn, but we can take on c3 here. And black wants to play queen a5 next if if b takes c3 happens. So yeah, and if rook takes d8, then after this sequence, I think like let's just say rook takes d8, takes here, bc3. After move like rook d3 here, the c3 pawn is gonna fall eventually. So instead, if bc3, we can play queen a5, and in general, black has a very good compensation in this kind of position. Like knight e5, rook ac8, rook b1, we can just grab the pawn, and we should be fine in this kind of position. We restore material equality, and we have targets on the queen side here, c4 and b4. Let's say rook d4, b6, even breaking down the center. And I like this move king h7, not rushing to take the c pawn here because we want to escape the back rank check, and black is just better here. So instead of knight e5, queen d2 is also possible defending c3, but white can't actually hold on to this extra pawn because they will suffer horribly after rook f d8, queen b2. We can even trade pieces because, yeah, like for example here, the e4 pawn already falls. Yeah, and so like queen c2 is possibly better, but still I would think that a move like, oh, actually bishop a4 I think just wins, or like rook takes d1 first, and if rook takes d1, bishop a4. Yeah, that's just a nice skewer. So instead of that, queen b4 is also possible, the main move, but now we just take on a2, and our queen is actually fine here on this side of the board. Rook a3, the idea is possible to try to strand the queen on d2, but now after a5, trying to distract the queen from the b file, queen b1, e5 here is nice, and after knight f5, king h7, stepping out of any knight e7 to d5 tricks, with check. And after rook d3, this is just a possible sample line where black seems to be doing fine in this kind of position. Even though it does seem a bit risky, black has an outside pass pawn, and it's well supported. So moves like this, planning to double up the rooks and push the a pawn to victory, black has a great position because the c6 bishop prevents any doubling on the d file and preventing any infiltration on the 7th rank. So yeah, black is doing fine in this position theoretically. So that's rook fe1. Yeah, rook fd1 is also possible, but let's look at queen d3. Trying to it's just a useful move, also preparing knight d4. So for example, if black plays bishop c6, knight d4 is a typical idea to try to take on c6 and weaken the structure. So h6 here, now bishop e3, and now b5. So also in these kind of positions, it's very important to realize when b5 is possible. Yeah, because for example here, it's possible because if white takes on b5 twice, then the e4 pawn hangs, and that's a very typical idea as we saw before. And otherwise, we're also threatening b4 to mislodge the knight on c3. So this b5 move is very important to notice. And if a3, now we can play queen b8, preparing b4. Bishop d2, also e5 here is nice, freeing the e6 square for the bishop at the cost of weakening the f5 square. For example, knight h4 has been tried, but here after rook c8, f4 was played, and then now b4. After ab4, rook a1, this makes the rook misplaced on a1, and we can play queen b6 check, actually. This is an improvement. After, let's say, bishop e3, queen takes b4, both the pawn on f4 and pawn on b2 are bound to be taken, and black has a good position. So instead of queen d3, rook fd1 is possible, and now we again play bishop c6. So this gets out of the pin along the d file because there was a threat of playing e5, d takes e5, and bishop takes f6 to undermine the defense of the d7 bishop. So now bishop c6. And now we want to prepare b5 next, and queen a5 if needed. And after queen d3, white usually plays this move to prepare knight d4 and also gain control over the b5 square to prevent b5. But now after h6, yeah, both bishop h4 and bishop e3 can transpose potentially to the 7th move, castles. But yeah, we can just use some thematic ideas to try to get out of the situation. So bishop takes f6 is I guess possible, but doesn't really give white much because black does get 2 bishops. And queen takes d6, we can trade the queens, take on c3, and take on e4 next. So yeah, this position is fine, but it is quite tricky, I have to say. Instead, we can look at castling, and now knight f6. And so here, if we play c4, if white plays c4, then again we can go for g6, knight c3, bishop g7, and we get this typical Moscow bind position. If they play bishop g5, we can just castle, rook ad1, and this was played by Nepomniachtchi against Nishikori, and bishop e6 is actually an improvement to prepare knight d5. For example, if you allow knight d5 with the discovery on the queen, then knight takes c3 can damage the pawn structure. So queen d3 is best, but now b5. And again, this is possible because the a2 pawn is potentially going to fall if white takes twice, and if that white takes on b5 with the with the knight. And if queen takes b5, then after queen c7, black has threats of bishop c4 with a fork, and also rook fb8 to put pressure on the b file. So this is like a typical Benko Gambit kind of pawn sacrifice, but in here it's just really good since black's pieces are all active already. Instead of bishop g5, queen d3 is possible, just getting out of the x-ray, and so here castles. And now b5 is prevented with this move queen d3. So white can also play a4 to prevent b5 further, because it's a typical idea here that, for example, if white plays a move like h3, just a simple move, then b5 here is quite strong. After a takes, and then again knight takes b5, just loses the e4 pawn, for example. And if they play a4 here, we can actually just play bishop g4. We want to trade pieces and also prepare knight d7 to e5 to put pressure on the c4 pawn. And yeah, this knight d7 maneuver is quite common in the Moscow bind, since the knight is blocking the bishop's view on g7. So black is doing fine in this position. Instead of c4, bishop g5 is also possible, and here we go for e6. Again, because when white plays bishop g5 when the knight is on f6, we cannot play a move like g6 since bishop takes f6 would ruin the pawn structure. So e6 is forced, and white has a bunch of moves, but playing a move like c4 here, we can just play h6 and kick the bishop back. Let's say bishop e3, we play bishop e7, knight c3, and just bring the bishop to c6, bring the queen to a5, rook to c8, and we can also open up the rook's eyes with a move like bishop e8 to consolidate everything with a fine position. And queen d3 is a main move because it prevents the b5 break. But now after knight g4, we want to win the bishop on the Darcy bishop. So after bishop f4, we can even play f5 here, and black puts a lot of pressure on white's position. Let's say bishop d6, fe4, knight takes e4, bishop takes e6, queen d6. We can trade like this and take on f3, and it turns out after rook f8, black just has a lot of initiative with the pawn on f2 being weak, and material is actually equal here. So this position is quite nice for black, but very forcing. Instead of bishop e3, bishop takes f6 is also possible, but after queen takes f6, the double pawns on the f file don't really mean much here, since the king, since first up we have the open g file, we have bishop c6 possible, we have bishop e7 and king d7 possible. And we can even bring the rook to c8 to put pressure on the c file. This is generally quite a nice endgame for black. It often comes out of the Richter rouser, actually, this kind of pawn structure, but in this position with the queens off the board, this is typically known to be quite good for blacks. And instead, if we play e5 here, we can take on e5 and play long castles. And black is better because they have the bishop pair in this game, played by Ivan Sarge on the black side. Instead, if they play bishop h4, now we can play bishop e7, knight c3, and castles. And since we were already castled, we want to play b5 next. And so white can play rook f1, but bishop c6 just gets out of any potential e5 pushes. And here we have ideas of playing queen a5. If white plays a4, we can play queen b4 even to stop the advance of the b pawn and control the dark squares. And we can bring a rook to d8 even, and play for a potential b5 break if possible. So going back here, instead of c4, white has a bunch of moves, like rook d1 is possible, but after bishop c6, we should be fine in this position because we're forcing white to make a concession with knight c3 to defend the e4 pawn, which would block actually the c pawn from being able to push forward. So this is quite okay. Knight c3 is also possible, but now bishop c6, and now we want to play bishop e7 next. So the only critical line here is, let's say, knight d5, after which we can play e takes d5, e d5, and bishop d7. And white gets, a big attack here, it seems, after bishop e7 and bishop f6 and queen takes f6, but we are up a piece. And white has a few tactics here. For example, they can play rook takes e7, but after queen takes e7 and rook e1, we are just in time to play with the move bishop e6. And after, let's say, queen h6, we can long castle, get our king out of danger, d6, fe6, rook takes e6, and queen f7. And black is up on exchange, and white has enough compensation for it, but it's not going to be enough, or it's not going to be more than enough compensation. So that's possible, but instead, queen h6 can try to maintain the pressure, trying to take on h7 next, and the king is still stuck in the center. But luckily, we have this move bishop g4. Trying to create some threats with like bishop takes f3 next. And so queen takes h7. And now, if we want to go for a win, then we have to play the move king d7. Let's say knight d2, rook c8, h3, rook h8, queen takes f7, rook f8, something like this. And where we create an imbalance, where we're up in exchange, but we are down 3 pawns. So this position is playable and equal, but a way to potentially force a repetition is after king f8, queen h6, rook g7, and going for this kind of repetition. So that's possible, and that's a critical line. Instead of knight d5, rook fe1 is also possible, but after bishop e7, we can often just get a very fine game. For example, this one just transposes to ed5. ed5 transposes to, takes bishop d7 and bishop f6 like we saw before, but we can also play bishop takes d5 and play e5 with just a good knight or structure. So we have a couple options in this kind of position. Instead, knight bd2 is also possible, which intends knight c4. But here we can play bishop c6. So if we play a move like bishop e7, which is possible, but after bishop f6 and gf6, this does, create a double-edged position where I don't particularly like black's chances because typically in this kind of structure, I want to exchange the queens. I want to have already exchanged the queens because this position can be quite dangerous for black with the king still stuck in the center. So bishop c6 is better. And after knight c4, we can actually just lead to mass simplifications after bishop takes e4. Let's say bishop f6, queen f6 takes and d5. After queen e2, dc4, queen takes c4, we can play bishop e7 and castle next with comfortable equality. Let's say after c3 and castles, it's just very equal. So that is the line after, I think c4, g6, knight c3. No, that is actually the line after bishop g5, e6, and knight bd2. Yep. So we've covered essentially this 7th move, castles. And the last move here is knight c3. So this is the only move that prevents us from going knight f6, because it can be met with bishop g5 followed by, let's say, e6 and the long castling. And this is quite annoying because there's pressure on d6 here, and if we play bishop e7, yeah, white can already consider bishop takes f6 there, or just continue with rook a1. So this is quite annoying. And so here it's important either to play the move rook c8 or play e5 immediately. So the thing is that rook c8, it just says that you have the option of going for bishop g5, which is a risky sideline as we saw before. And so I'm tempting you into playing bishop g5. And so rook c8 is the typical move that we want to play anyways. So I do like this move order, but we can look at it from the move e5. And for queen d3, which is the best square for the queen, we can play rook c8, the universal option, because developing the knight with knight f6 allows bishop g5. And so now if white plays bishop g5, this is not threatening because we can move the queen away, play queen c7, put pressure on the c pawn potentially, and also kick the bishop with h6 next. And after castles, h6, bishop h4, and g5, we get a thematic position as we saw before, which is quite good for black. Instead, if they castle, then after h6, this prevents knight f6. This prepares knight f6 while preventing bishop g5. And so here, if white plays a move like knight d5, they're actually just walking into a skewer with bishop e5. So they do need to be careful. And if they play a move like rook d1, this is also possible, just putting pressure on d6. But here we continue with knight f6, and now knight d2. So this is the idea that we saw before, where the knight prepares to go to c4, to go to e3, and dominate the d5 square. And here it's important to know an important finesse. We will see this finesse later in the mainline variation after knight 10, the 10th move, knight d2, where we can actually play the move bishop g4, provoking f3, either f3 or making the rook move. And so this is actually important later on for concrete reasons, which you can look at in the PJ down below for the reason why this bishop g4 and this specific line after 10th move rook d1 is actually good. But knight d2 is the main move, and here we can play queen c7, and we have ideas of just playing, first off we're preventing knight c4, we have ideas of playing knight f6, bishop e6, and after bishop e7 we can just castle. And if white plays a move like f3, this is just a waste of time. It solidifies the center, but we play knight f6, rook d1, and bishop e6. So typically we play bishop e6 before bishop e7, because the knight, after the rook has left f1, the knight can also go to e3 via f1 to c4, via f1 to e3, and then control the d5 square. And so after bishop e6, if white plays knight f1, we can play bishop c4, preparing to exchange the bishop for the knight. And even after queen d2, we can even break in the center with d5, opening up the position. After e d5, bishop c5 with tempo, king f1, we can take on f1. And after rook takes f1, bishop b4, black is ready to play bishop takes c3 to double the pawns, castle, and make point out that the d5 pawn is actually weak. So this position is just good for black. Instead, if they play h3, which prevents the important move bishop g4, we can play knight f6, and let's say white plays a4. We can just play to try to gain some space on the queen side here, seeing that plans of knight c4 to e3 are not possible. We can just continue with bishop e7, rook d1, castles, and let's say knight f1. And now it's possible to play bishop e6, and after let's say knight e3, you can play queen c5. Ideas like this, where we're just playing positionally with the bishop coming potentially to a5 and things like that. Yeah, this is an option you can see in the BGN. But additionally, this move d5 was introduced by Wojtaszek against Nepomniachtchi. It just opens up lines, and after knight takes d5, which is not best, we can take on d5 because queen takes d5 here loses to bishop a4, since we have rook fd8 as a threat and also bishop takes c2 as a threat. So we're going to be at least winning a pawn. Instead, if e takes d5, we can play bishop d6, blockading the pawn on d5 here, still attacking the c2 pawn, and we're freeing up the f pawn to move forward to f5. And so black has more than enough compensation in this kind of position. Instead of e takes d5, now we can play the thematic move knight e8 to blockade the d6 pawn with the knight. And if we blockade the d6 pawn with the knight, we're able to push just f5 freely, and the knight on c3 will not have access to the d5 square. So here it's important to give back the pawn with d6. So after bishop takes c6, knight d5 is possible. And now it's important to play queen c6, because potentially queen takes c2 can run into knight b6 maybe, or something like that. So queen c6, knight f3, f5, and now we continue with our plan, b3, bishop e6, and we have ideas even of like playing rook f7 to double on the c file after we play f4 and take on d5, let's say. Black just has a very nice position because even though white has a strong d5 knight, we have very fluid pawns in the center, and looks just like a very free-flowing attack. So instead of h3, we can look at the main line with rook d1, and now we can play the bishop g4. So this was introduced by Geary against Michael Adams in the 2016 London Classic. The idea is to provoke f3, which weakens the g1 to a7 diagonal, so that for concrete reasons, this black can later push the d5 advance and open up the diagonal for the bishop. So that's the idea. Now we can look at rook e1, which slightly misplaces the rook as it no longer controls the d5 square. And so here we can just play knight f6, knight f1, bishop e6, since we know that the knight is going to play to e3 and kick the bishop with tempo. This is just a useful prophylactic move. Let's say knight e3, bishop e7. We managed to successfully misplace this rook on on e1, so this is kind of an achievement. Let's say white plays a4 and we play castles. Black just gets a better version of the line included with h3 before, since white will have to play rook d1 eventually, and h3 is a more useful move than playing rook back to e1. So this is kind of just an improved version of that h3 line. Instead, if they play f3 after bishop e6 and knight f1, white prepares knight e3 here, and so it's good to play knight f6 here. And if, let's say, white plays a move like bishop e3, preparing to bring the bishop back to f2 and playing knight e3 next to control d5, we can now actually break with d5. Let's say after e takes d5, we can play rook d8, regaining the d5 pawn, and with the bishop here in open position, and the f3 move just weakening the white king. This is just a good position for black. And instead of knight takes d5, we can play bishop takes d5, e5, and take on c2. And since the pawn on d6 for black has been removed, this means that black does not have to worry about anything else. The only weakness that black needs to worry about is the b7 pawn, but we can see that in this line after rook ac1. This leads to mass exchanges, king d7 takes on here. So yeah, for example, in this endgame, this is quite comfortable because the d5 pawn for white is a weakness, but it's not a clear draw because black's b7 pawn is also weak, and ideas of like rook b3 can put pressure on this pawn. So a sample line can go like knight d2, king d7, knight c4, bishop d6, important to defend the e5 pawn, knight b6 check, king e7, rook c3, rook d8, a4, bishop b8, attacking d5, rook b3, and now bishop c7 back, knight c4, and now we can trade on d5, take on b7, and this endgame is approximately equal with moves like h5, for example, something like this. Knight f4, getting some squares, and this position is just equal according to the computer. So it's definitely not like bishop e3 is not an inaccuracy in the sense that white gets a worse position, but it's definitely not the best move because it allows d5. And instead of knight e3, now we can play bishop e7, and white can play a4 here, just preventing b5 forever, but they can also just like not include a4 at all. This is the most common move actually, which was played by Dominguez and Luke McShane, to name a few players. And the idea is that white plays without including a4. That's after castles, king h1, just useful to get out of the long diagonal. Now we can play b5 since white has not played a4. But the idea that white has is to play a4, saying that white is waiting for black to play b5 so that they can undermine this these queenside pawns. But now we play b4, kicking the strong knight away. After knight d5, bishop d5, e5, and a5, black's queenside pawns are targets, but they have the c5 square to work with to put the knight on. They have the g5 square to play with, and this is quite a fair position. For example, c3 was played once before, just logical to undermine the structure. But now we can take on c3 and play g6 to prevent knight f5, and we can continue with knight d7 next. Let's say here, knight d7, and there are actually no good discoveries with the bishop on the c file here, and black can continue with knight c5 and bishop g5 next. So this is just equal. So instead of that, a4 is possible, just preventing b5, and now we can castle bishop d2 and a rook f d8. So black is just preparing d5 next, which is why the bishop on d2 isn't amazing, but it's necessary to finish development. The bishop has no future on the on any other diagonal, for example. Bishop e1, and now this opens up the d file, and it looks like it prevents d5 because white is controlling it more than black. But black has this move d5, and just it breaks open the position and opens it up for the bishops. For example, if white plays knight e takes d5 and bishop takes d5, this was the line played in the Michael Adams versus Geary game. E takes d5. Black can play bishop b4 here and prepare to take on c3 with the bishop and take on d5 with the knight next. And the weakening with this move, with including this move f3, shows that black's dark squares, or rather white's dark squares, sorry, are actually just very weak. And so black is actually fighting for advantage here. So instead of e takes d5, now it shows the idea, the secondary idea of like provoking this move f3 is that we can pin the knight on e3 and we can prepare knight takes d5 next. And so this innocent f3 move that we saw before just actually is a big concession that white is forced to play. And after bishop f2, we just played twice, just breaking the pin. Black can just restore material equality with bishop e3, knight takes d5. And here both rook takes d5 and bishop takes d5 are fine. But the difference is that rook takes d5 allows an exchange of rooks, while bishop takes d5 keeps more rooks on the board. But here, a game played by Sabino Brunello in 2018 showed the path to gaining an advantage after rook takes d5, exchanging a pair of rooks. And after rook d1 and bishop c6, if you look at the position, position looks, should look equal, but actually black's bishop is far superior to this bishop on f2, and black has free-flowing pawns with pawns f5, for example, to come. And if black keeps pieces on the board, then it will be difficult for white to defend actually. For example, in this game, b3 is played, defending the a4 pawn, and rook e8, just defending e5. For queen b6, it's important, this move actually prepares to take control of the dark squares, but it's important here not to exchange the queens with a move like queen e7. After bishop e3, now f5. And now with the bishop on this diagonal, lines can quickly open up with moves like f4 and e4, for example. And after queen c5, again, queen f7, avoiding the exchange. And after queen c3, f4, and followed by e4, black finally breaks through. And after fe4, in the game, rook takes e4 was played, but the computer points out this improvement, which is the move rook e6. Just preparing to capture on e4 next with the bishop without allowing rook d8 to exchange the rooks, because we need to keep more pieces on the board if we want to continue the attack. So for example, rook e8, king h7, bishop f2, and now queen g6 with moves like bishop takes e4 and pressure on the on the white king. So it's important to do that because after rook takes e4, this actually allowed rook d8, king h7, and white to play the move queen d3, which is actually very annoying with the pin. And black will have to play like queen g6, but we don't really want to walk into this pin, which if we want to break the pin, then we have to exchange pieces. So this is not ideal. So here instead, as I said before, after fe4, rook e6 is just a nice improvement, and black is just better. So that concludes this video actually. There are some very interesting lines and like very forcing lines in this variation after the fourth move d4. But in general, black is doing fine, and they just need to remember their theory to, remember this bishop g4 finesse to provoke the pawn to going to f3. And for example, it's quite common, I could see that in this position, inexperienced players can choose this move bishop g5, which prevents both e5 and knight f6. But after h6, black is in very good shape. So that concludes this video. If you have any questions or suggestions or comments, any additional inputs on this variation, please do comment those down below. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.